Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another edition of Friday at the Funhouse with Martin Popoff on this hazy, hot, and humid day in New York. 99, they're saying today, Martin.
Yeah, it's pretty hot here too, and definitely in BC, where my folks are. They still got lots and lots of fires, and they're getting 100-degree weather in BC.
Oh, so heat, humidity, fire, smoke, no good.
Well, it's dry there. Here we've got a lot of humidity, and it is.
So there they got the dry heat and not the humidity. Well, that's probably good, but
they're 8 hours inland from the coast, right? They're in the bloody desert mountains, all that kind of stuff, right?
Oof. So any relief in sight for them as far as like all?
No, this is supposed to be another big wave where there could be a lot more fires. So. And there hasn't been much rain. They just got a little bit of rain. They're not literally in a desert, but there is a lot of desert in BC, and there's a lot of scrubby stuff and really rocky mountains. Not the Rocky Mountains, but where my folks are, it's like rocky old mountains, like hilly mountains, but not a lot of trees. So they definitely a lot of BC is burned down this year. That's for sure.
That's no good. Yeah, I hear too much about this, especially in North America in recent years. I know I have a lot of folks that I know out in California, in Northern California, and what they've had to go through over the last bunch of years, just terrible. So anyway, our thoughts go out to everybody who's experiencing these sorts of things these days, and hopefully we get some rain and a little bit of relief. So, but to kind of kill some time here, we're going to talk about some of our favorite producers and some of the works that we love by them. So Martin and I have each kind of identified 5 different producers that we like quite a bit, and we'll talk about some of the albums and the reasons why we like these production methods, or what we like about the way these albums come out. I don't know. It's for me, it's kind of hard to talk about this stuff. It's like, you like the albums, you like the way they sound. So we'll see how we kind of get through this. So I'll have Martin kick us off with his number 5 selection.
Yeah, you're right. It is hard to talk about because my 5 all have different things I want to say about them, kind of thing, right? It's a weird thing, production. Okay, so I'm going to start with Tony Visconti. Now, I've been really preoccupied with Tony Visconti lately because I'm working on a Bowie book. But what I like about Tony is that he was in there super early with Bowie. He's a player too. He's a serious producer and song guy. He was in Bowie's bands to begin with early on. He's a bass player. There's my favorite Bowie album. He worked on this one. He worked on all that kind of Berlin years stuff as well. But there's Heathen later on. When he came back with Bowie, he did some amazing, cool production things. But he doesn't have a sound. He's just really good at exploring and finding really cool new things, like that whole Berlin years, Berlin trilogy era. Working with Brian Eno and stuff. He was just always really good at inventing new things and coming up with new ways to make music. And of course, Butch would appreciate this. Thin Lizzy, right? He did these 2 albums apropos of nothing, really. I mean, this is an okay sounding Thin Lizzy album. It's not a great sounding Thin Lizzy album, but I have a feeling that Tony seems to be the kind of guy who can also manage band personalities as well, which is super important. And Thin Lizzy, there was always some tension there going. Obviously, there's only 3 guys on the cover there. This is a great sounding Thin Lizzy album.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of drug problems and stuff, and Tony can deal with that as well. He's dealt with lots of guys with drug problems, dealing with David Bowie during that period, of course, and Iggy. He did a cool Iggy album. But yeah, this is one of my favorite sounding Thin Lizzy albums, and it's super high for me. And this one, not so much. This one sounds like Jailbreak to me more than anything, lacking a little bottom end, lacking a little, true dynamics. I think Johnny the Fox is actually a better sounding album, but Tony obviously did a ton of different things. I don't super appreciate what he did for T-Rex. And you know how much I love The Damned, and I love almost every Damned album, and I really don't like what he did on that last Damned album very much. I don't like the production at all on the Damned Evil Spirit. So there's a big mark against him. But Scary Monsters, Heathen, Reality, The Next Day, Black Star. So he came back with Bowie right to the end. Black Star is an amazing sounding album with really cool arrangements and strange instruments and stuff. So he's a fearlessly creative guy and a really creative guy, and he comes up the right way from being a musician as well. So I think he adds a lot to the projects that he's part of, but he doesn't have his own sound particularly.
If I remember correctly, I think he worked on a couple of Gentle Giant albums. He did some of the prog rock bands back early on, and yeah, and those albums are kind of like unremarkable sounding. They're unique for sure.
Yeah,
but yeah,
Sparks. And he's American, but he went to the UK very early on and spent a lot of time in the UK.
Yeah, right? Yep, cool. Yeah, it's a good choice, and yeah, not. I would say some of the guys that I picked have sort of an identifiable sound, but not because and that's the interesting thing. And I think you already brought it up in the Visconti pick. You look at some of these albums and they really don't sound anything alike. There's definitely one guy I'm going to talk about who has a very distinct style and sound is what he gets out of his bands. But there's others that kind of don't. And what's better? I don't know. Is it you have that sound, or you bring something different out of every artist you work with? And is that better or worse? I don't know. Hard to say. My number 5 was a late addition to my list. I actually swapped this out like about an hour before we did the show this morning, because the more I thought about it, my original number 5 pick was more out of nostalgia for me. And I'll talk about him at the end as kind of like an honorable mention. But I think, overall, I don't know how well what he did really holds up. And I was thinking, well, I love a lot of those albums, so I'm going to push that aside for now. I decided to go with Terry Brown, who, of course, very famous for working with Rush on a lot of those great early albums. He went out to work with a lot of other different artists over the years. But, more importantly, he was the guy working on albums like this with Rush, and this, and this, and this, and this, and even the early ones. And I don't know, arguably you could say like some of those early Rush albums, like 2112 and Fly By Night and Caress of Steel are maybe not great sounding albums. I think that the two, him and the band, would work well together and really kind of solidify their partnership with the albums that I just showed, which is the reason why I kind of highlighted those. And I think by the time of Moving Pictures and Signals, I mean, they were putting out some great sounding stuff together, even Permanent Waves too. Hemispheres as well. I mean, those albums to me sound really good, because they're just bringing all these different elements, taking Rush away from that earlier just pure heavy rock band and incorporating all these little nuances, which is what I really love about his production style. Is he was able to get all these little things out of these 3 guys and really make it sound like something fresh and different. And you could hear every little thing that Neil was doing, all these little, all this keyboards that Geddy's starting to bring to the table. The bass is up front and you hear it, all the textures from Alex. And I really like that. And I also like the fact that he brought that to the table when he worked with Fates Warning. Specifically these 2 albums for me, A Pleasant Shade of Gray and Parallels, which I think have a lot of those same qualities. And you take this band that had a really dense sound early on with other producers, and all of a sudden now there's this kind of this sheen and this attention to detail, which I think was really key for both of these bands. And he's worked with other artists as well, like the Upper Midwest prog band Tiles is another perfect example. Tiles is a very good band. And again, not that Tiles necessarily sounds like Rush, but when I listen to those Tiles albums that he worked on, it reminds me of some of these Rush albums. Not that the songs sound like them, not like the riffs sound like, they don't sound like Rush songs, but there are these textures and things that you hear in the music that I'm like, that's the Terry Brown touch. And I think that usually is the sign of a producer, whether you like him or her or not, that they bring something to the table that kind of has that certain touch, that feel. It's like, so here, the Terry Brown touch. This is one of those producers that when I listen to the albums he's worked on, I hear these little things and I'm like, oh yeah, that's Terry Brown production. So whereas with some of these other guys, you get every album sounds a little different. So anyway, whether that makes any sense or not, I don't know. But Terry Brown, my late entry into this discussion, was not originally going to discuss him. I've always liked him, but the more I thought about it, I was like, yeah, you know what? He's a good one to bring up here.
Yeah, a Voivod,
Yeah,
and you know, halfway through Mutiny Up My Sleeve for Max Webster, but he did High Class and Board Shoes.
that's you know, the Max Webster stuff. Yeah, I totally
High
forgot. Those are
Class
great
is one of
sounding
the
albums.
greatest sounding albums of the 70s, I think.
Yep.
Like amazing production on that. And then the subtle things he did through that whole golden period Rush catalog in dealing with those guys as a trio and getting it, you know, to the big digital phase later on and everything. It's those are, you know, I always think of him as this super bright and bubbly power trio sound that he captured mostly on Hemisphere's Farewell, and I would say mostly on Permanent Waves when you think of Spirit of Radio.
Yeah.
An amazing, bright, just lively, vivacious sort of sound he got out of those guys.
And it's basically what that band needed, right? Because the Caress of Steel sound was really, as much as I love that album, that was not working for the general public, right? I mean, he had to bring something else out of them, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so my next one is a very complicated choice. Rick Rubin, who is a real love it or hate it guy, right? I mean, there's so much said about him, you know, with the big long beard and everything. And you know, what starting with the negative, I mean, I guess what everybody says about him, and I've interviewed many bands and I've heard, you know, pretty much nothing but negative about him, but I know there's a lot of positives as well. It's just almost by coincidence, and maybe it's just with the heavy bands, but this idea that he's not really around very much, he doesn't do very much, he relies on the engineers and the producers to do stuff, blah, blah, blah. But I've also heard a lot of positive about him. And that is, you know, he'll ask bands to come up with 2.5 albums worth of stuff. He's really good at pointing and picking out the material that's good and not good, and saying, you know, scrap that one, change that, move that, whatever. So he's really good at that, and you know, this whole kind of Eastern philosophy, go with the flow, bare feet sort of thing about him, right? So, but why I picked him, so why I wouldn't, you know, why there are sometimes marks against these guys is he's done a ton of albums that I know aren't considered great productions. And then he's done a ton by you know, a whole bunch of artists like Dixie Chicks and you know, I couldn't dissect what he did for Red Hot Chili Peppers throughout, Johnny Cash, etc. that I almost could have no opinion on. But you know, I would have, say, a negative of opinion on Black Sabbath 13, for example. Not crazy about the production of that. And the other big thing that I've heard a lot about him that people don't like is the volume wars, where he did this thing where everything was pushed up front in the mix. The records came out uniformly too loud. He was apparently one of the bad guys with that. You know, some varying results with System of a Down, etc. But I wanted to pick him because there's probably no production run and distinct production sound out of a guy that I enjoyed more than what you would get on things like the first Masters of Reality album, Trouble, right?
Yep.
Trouble, Manic Frustration, Cult Electric, and especially Danzig 4, Danzig 4P, whatever you want to call it. There's a 4 kind of thing on it. Not so much on When the Gods Kill, but also even things like the Wolfsbane album and the first Four Horsemen album. So he had this run with heavy metal. I'm not even getting to Slayer, because Slayer is almost a different sound. He literally didn't do what he did on these records that he did for Slayer, but the Slayer records had amazing sounds as well. Rain and Blood, I love South of Heaven, and Seasons in the Abyss a lot as well. But Slayer's another one of those bands that, even though Rick Rubin had a long association with them, you know, even they've said some disparaging things about working with them as well. And we know it didn't work out with ZZ Top. You know, that thing did not last. But I just love the sounds. And again, what a lot of people will say about these Rick Rubin things is, you know, the secret weapon in all this was the engineer and the mix and/or, right? So you've got your Dave Bianco or Andy Wallace, who went on to be a great producer, right? But what he did on so many of these records is just this great separation between really molten bottom end and bass and great sounding guitars, a lot of high end on the hi-hats and the cymbals, you know, perfect bass drum sound. It just sounded so lively and heavy, yet it didn't sound like epic. It sounded, it sounded almost like a super high fidelity version of a Basement Jam, if that makes any sense. Really sort of characterized by this album. And like I say, even the Four Horsemen stuff as well. And yeah, Danzig 4P, Danzig 2 as well. So it's funny, he's got this whole hip hop history, and then all these other artists, and then all this thing about the philosophy of stripping everything away and stripping things down. I don't know how much I totally believe in that part of it, but and the Trouble album definitely fits along this as well. So I'm picking for a very specific thing, what he did on those heavy metal albums in sort of the 90s, the late 80s and 90s kind of thing, because it is a really identifiable sound, which he doesn't even do later on. And a lot of people complain about that as well, saying, he's overrated because he doesn't have a sound. And it's not like every album he did, has great sound, and the Volume Wars, and he's never around. But the other thing is there's a lot of success with his records too, right? That's an incredible thing as well. Like, I've heard a lot of people say grudgingly, I don't like Rick Rubin, but dang, those albums he did for all these bands are my favorite albums by those bands. And was it him doing it? Well, in a very abstract philosophical way, apparently it was. So there you go, Rick Rubin. He's
got the magic touch, apparently, right? Yep. You can't argue with success. Yep. Yeah. So speaking of a guy who definitely has an identifiable sound, and you could arguably say a lot of the albums this guy has worked on kind of all sound so similar, but man, do they sound good. And I just could not deny, I just couldn't leave him off of this list, because quite frankly, I love the way all these albums sound, even if there is an element of kind of like interchangeability amongst the many bands he's worked with. Andy Sneap. I mean, an Andy Sneap album a mile away. There is just something big and bold and ferocious. He's a guitar player. He knows how to record and produce guitarists. He really does. I mean, I don't know in recent years any other producer who gets such big, crunchy, ferocious sounds out of every single band he works with. It's mind-boggling. So whether it's, bands like Testament, or whether it's, the obvious most recent one is Judas Priest, right? We worked with Tom Allom on that. Especially Accept. I mean, all of a sudden these Accept albums all sound bigger than life. He's worked with Megadeth. He worked with Nevermore. Who else? Blaze. He worked with Fozzy, Creator, Arch Enemy, Opeth, Master Plan. I got a Master Plan CD here as well. Just these, and you talk about the loudness wars, right? I mean, maybe he's like one of the worst offenders of this. I mean, these albums, these CDs are loud, in your face, but they're still very crisp and crystal clear, but it's all about the guitars. Roaring, metallic, crunchy guitars. The vocals are high in the mix. You get enough bottom end, but really it's all about, if you want to hear guitar oriented music and specifically metal, all right, this is the guy. He is without a doubt the guy. And, do a lot of these albums have a very similar feel to them? Hell yeah. But I don't see anybody complaining about it. And I don't complain about it either. I'm like, oh yeah, that's Andy Sneap production. Yeah, it sounds like their last album and the one before that, and the album by that band and the album by that band. But you know what? I love them all. And it's pleasing to my ears. And that's, I guess, the old school metal fan in me who still has a special place for stuff that sounds like this. Even though as I get older, I tend to, want to listen to stuff a little more nuanced, I think. And I'll kind of get to that with some of these other ones. But Andy Sneap's productions, to me, whether he's producing or mixing the albums, there's something about what he does that just goes in here and the heart goes boom, 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 boom. I love it. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So high fidelity, so perfect, and he's in Judas Priest, right? Sort of, right? Which is really cool as well. And he came from Sabat, which was such a cool, awesome, thinking man, heavy metal band,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's funny because if you go and look at all the list of albums he's worked on, he's probably mixed even more than he actually has produced. But yet, whatever he's doing, whether he's producing or mixing, there is that Andy Sneap thing at the end, right? So when you hear one of those albums, you're like, oh yeah, Andy was involved in that somehow. Maybe he just breathed on the console. I don't know, but whatever he did, that pixie dust it's all over it.
Yeah, cool. All right. Okay, so my next choice is Jack Endino. Seattle came up with, this is probably the best sounding of all of them. The first Mudhoney EP, Super Fuzz Big Muff, so powerful. And it's just like, if grunge swept aside hair metal, basically Jack Endino had a lot to do with it, because he's producing a lot of this early stuff. Like I say, this is just so ferociously heavy and dangerous sounding and wild. And it's like everything that had slowly been leached away from heavy metal over the hair metal years. He kind of brought it back, working at Reciprocal there. He's such a music guy. He loves old 70s. Like he's a super, expert on all kinds of 70s obscurities. Him and the whole grunge thing like really brought back, really earthy sounding tones out of all instruments. Nirvana, Bleach, killer crushing production on that, really distorted. And then some Green River, even before Mudhoney. He did so many of those bands working there at Reciprocal, and then even did some of the cool post grunge stuff that we don't even really talk about very much on Roadrunner, Road Race, or whatever. Grunt Truck, he did both of these.
Yeah, I remember those. Yep.
And he even did Bruce Dickinson's Skunk Works, which is a well-regarded album that's coming up in the estimation of a lot of people. Like Bruce wanted somebody who knew all these very creative bands, thinking outside of the box bands, and got involved with this, and it sounds great, and it's a super interesting album. So yeah, I just love the fact that he's worked on so many things. He's like one of the busiest guys ever. And he's so indie, and he's got so much street cred, yet he's just a super nice guy, really down to earth guy. And he's so important in all of that early stuff. And he's a player himself. He had his own band. Well, even his solo albums, but he's had Skin Yard for all those years. So he comes at it again from that honest place, and is just toiling away in there. One of the most important guys, across all these, the big four bands get all the credit, but Jack is kind of in there all over the place. Soundgarden's first EP, I believe, yes, Screaming Life. So yeah, incredible sounds he got out of all these things. That they're not low fidelity at all. They're basically they're specifically chosen to be low and dirty in certain ways, but all the bass is there, all the treble is there, and all the danger is there. So Jack Endino.
You mentioned a good point. How many of these guys that we're going to talk about today were actual players themselves?
Yeah.
Right. Quite a few of them.
Yeah.
And you have to wonder like how important that is to doing what they do and doing it well. I mean, because it's like you would think that they would produce these albums as if they were their own, right? And if there was their own band, their own recording. So because they have that appreciation, that knowledge already, I'm sure it helps them working with these other musicians and trying to get the best out of them. So I think that's a key point that we all need to keep. They
appreciate that, the musicians, because it's almost like, well, I want you to do it like this or like this or like this. And these guys will just pick up the guitar and show you, right. Do this. Or they won't have to call the guitarist back from across the country to do a little part. They'll just do it themselves, and they'll just put it in, right? So having those utility guys that could do all that is super valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. All right, my next guy, really important to the kind of formation of the classic sound of one particular band, but he also worked with a lot of others and did some really great work there as well. And known as being somewhat of an oddity, Roy Thomas Baker. Right. So, of course, you mentioned Roy Thomas Baker and what comes to mind usually, but Queen, right? So, of course, Sheer Heart Attack, and of course, this, big blockbuster album, which I think was probably where it all came together, not only for him, but as well as for the band. He worked with them on jazz and other stuff, which I'll talk about shortly. But, when you listen to these classic Queen recordings, and God, we just talked about Queen recently and kind of the on another show where Queen kind of went from that early first couple of albums and then all of a sudden blossomed into this artistic band. How much of that was Roy Thomas Baker drawing that out of them, right? Because he's a guy who has done some artistic type albums, right, over his career. And you have to wonder, sometimes there is this relationship between producer and band that you just cannot understate, that by bringing them together, you get the best out of both of them. And, you know, you can argue about what's your favorite Queen album, but there's no denying that there are some amazing things happening on A Night at the Opera that we really hadn't heard of before, where you're using the studio almost like another instrument and being able to create these amazing sounds, stuff that like Hendrix was trying to do back late in his life and his career, right? All of a sudden now these studio trickery things are becoming commonplace. And I think that a lot of that, you know, Bohemian Rhapsody is a perfect example of being able to do some amazing things in the studio that you'd never heard before. All these multi-track voices and instrumental parts and things like that. So, so he, you know, you listen to these Roy Thomas Baker Queen albums, there is a distinctive sound on all of them, I think. And, you know, he went to work on with other bands, Bebop Deluxe, Futurama. A lot of cool sounds happening on this album. I think you could arguably say on every Bebop Deluxe album, but pretty cool stuff there. Two of my favorite Journey albums of all time, I think sound absolutely amazing, probably thanks to him. Infinity and Evolution, which came right after it. Very sophisticated sounds. Again, I think for me, with, you know, we just talked about the ferociousness of Andy Sneap. How about the sophisticated ways of Roy Thomas Baker? I think most of these albums that he worked on have this just real kind of clever nature about them. Some great arrangements on here. He worked really well with bands who had, you know, keyboard players and utilized strings and things like that. Candio, right? Another famous Roy Thomas Baker production. Again, kind of a new sound for him. Here you've got this kind of like new wave pop band, right? A little bit very sophisticated sounds on this. He did some prog rock stuff. Here you've got Fountains of Light by Starcastle. Great sounding album. Whereas their first two albums sound, or sorry, this is their second album. The first album sounds really, really good, but a little on the muddy side. Then you bring in Roy Thomas Baker and all of a sudden Larger Than Life. And let's not forget Head Games from Foreigner. Working with a heavier band, right? So this is a pretty rocking album from these guys, and does really well on there as well. And I think, again, just this air of professionalism throughout all of the things that he worked on, which, you know, maybe might not stand out as much as some of these other bands, but there are certain albums that he has worked on where, you know, you stop and you think it's like, wow, that is pretty special stuff that he did right there. So yeah, and a pretty fruitful period from like what, the mid 70s through about the mid 80s. I mean, he worked on a lot of stuff in those years, so he kept pretty busy. So there you have it.
Yeah, a lot of big hits. And you know, one thing he's known for, I think he could be given a lot of the credit for the vocal stuff with Queen, which he carried forward in other
true. Yep.
The Darkness later as well. He's also really known for being quite experimental and trying pretty audacious things that take a long time or cost a lot of money to set up. He's known for his flamboyance and luxury and love of good cars and good wine and partying and all that stuff, right, as well. So he was like a larger than life personality producer as well. But and I don't know if he particularly has a sound of his own later, but he essentially, for what he did on those Queen albums, that's enough right there. That's an incredible track record of you know, a similar characteristic throughput through a lot of those albums with a lot of those really cool production techniques, and a lot of that you get to give him credit for, because he is really known for being a big experimenter.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point about the vocals and what he was able to do on those Queen albums. And I'm going to go back to the Journey Infinity album. I would argue that there is no better Journey album with both Perry and Greg Raleigh singing. And this is Steve Perry's first album with the band. The way he recorded their vocals together on this album is absolutely masterful. And there is some very intricate, very different stuff on this particular album. I mean, there's a reason why this is my favorite Journey album. There's just elements on here that you don't hear anywhere else. Sure, there's the commercialism, which was always Journey from this point onward, but there's some other stuff going on here. Big, grand, majestic passages and arrangements that you could arguably say remind a little bit of some of that classic Queen stuff, with the way all the vocals are layered and the keyboards are mixed with the guitars, and these big swells and arrangements and things like that. So yeah, I mean, that's a really, really good point, and pretty talented guy, I think.
Yeah. All right, cool. My next choice, Joe Hardy, who is no longer with us anymore, but I appreciate him for a couple of reasons. Number one, he's kind of made ZZ Top, arguably my favorite band of all time. There's XXX. He comes in at Antenna, right? And then Rhythmine is one of my top ZZ Top albums of all time, crushing heavy album.
Yeah.
And I love Mescalero to death as well. I mean, I love everything ZZ Top's done, but I wouldn't call them my favorite band unless I loved all this 90s stuff. They all have the similar sound, and they're all produced by Joe Hardy, even though, Billy gets in on the production credit too. But it's definitely the distinct Joe Hardy sound, I think, working at Nashville mostly. And the other amazing thing he does is he brings in Greg Morrow to drum. And that is one of the key things about Joe Hardy's sound, is that really snappy, vibrant, trebly, tight snare sound that he gets out of Greg Morrow. It's literally the trademark Joe Hardy sound is those two guys working together. And you can hear it also, just like the ZZ Top, on Kim Mitchell Itch and Kim Mitchell Ain't Life Amazing. I don't know if you can hear it on, all sorts of other things he does, country rock or country or whatever. And, even, I don't really like to talk about it because I'm not absolutely sure. Besides Rhythmine, what isn't Frank Beard? This is Greg Morrow drumming on this. Is one of my favorite drum performances of all time by anybody, and it's Greg Morrow. But I suspect I always try to, every time I have to talk about these things, I always kind of look on the net and see if I can find, but they've kept this secret really, really, really quiet about who's drumming all over the place, right? But I have my suspicions about some other ones, but we know Greg Morrow as well, and the Joe Hardy sound got into the Billy F. Gibbons band as well. They're both there, I think, in the early days. I think Joe died before he could be on this last Billy Gibbons, because he died February 12th, 2019. But so I'm picking him for those two reasons. This great sound that he has of his own, which is doubly confirmed when you actually hear it on those two great Kim Mitchell albums as well. And then for the fact that he made ZZ Top my favorite band of all time by starting with Antenna, crushing, very technological sound, which I didn't appreciate in the very early days, because it was them starting with Eliminator, very electronic, and then slowly getting away from it and then getting back to an even more electronic sound. But I love that really obscure, strange, high-tech production on Antenna. I just love that record. And so from there forward, it is that sound. So that's those are the two reasons for Joe Hardy, for ZZ Top and for having his own sound.
To me, he brought the grind back to the ZZ Top once again, which I really appreciated. I mean, those albums he worked on, they sound great. They do. Yeah. And that's the ZZ Top I want to hear.
Yeah. Super bright. Great on the guitars as well. Great on Billy's gravelly voice, and really like some really extreme distortion on certain songs on guitar, but he doesn't do that all the time. Just an incredibly bright, high fidelity, lively sound across that 90s output.
So I can't wait to see all the comments and be like, no way, Frank totally played on that album. They've had the solidified lineup the entire time. But that was during Frank's pretty dark days, right? I mean, that was a...
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what exactly the reason was during that time. I mean, Frank's darkest days were when he was getting off heroin in the 70s.
Oh, right? Yeah.
But at this time, I think it's more like Billy didn't have a lot of patience with Dusty or Frank, like, I'm just going to do it myself or get someone else, or whatever. But I mean, when you hear Greg Morrow on both of those Kims, and when you hear him on at least the first Billy Gibbons, if not the second, I don't know, is he on the blues one as well? But what a great sound. What an incredible sound. But Rhythmine, just start to finish, that thing is a drum clinic. It's a tour de force of drums. And Billy doesn't let up either. Billy is just cranking the guitars through that whole album.
That to me is their best album since DeGayo for me. I mean, that's, Eliminator is great for what it is, but I would rather listen to Rhythmine any day. I don't know. That's a nasty album. Yeah. All right. My next guy is going to be Bob Ezrin. All right. So, and again, talk about a guy who has pretty much made a career almost out of, working with one artist not exclusively, because he's worked with a million people, but I mean, most people, you talk Bob Ezrin, you think Alice Cooper or Alice Cooper Band, and then Alice Cooper, the solo artist, right? So, and his, stamp is all over albums like this, and Billion Dollar Babies, and Schools Out, and quite frankly, for me, my two favorite productions from him are Killer and Love It to Death, which I think sound great. And he just brings to the table this kind of like, he's able to get out this and it's almost like you can't explain it, but there's this kind of theatricality to the music. There is this atmosphere. I think, is probably one of the things I like best about his productions, because even when you look at like Destroyer from Kiss, there all of a sudden are all these atmospheres and melodies on a Kiss album, which we never heard before. If you listen to the first couple of Alice Cooper albums, you're like, okay, especially when he was on Zappa's label, okay. But then all of a sudden, you hear this, and you hear this tremendous kind of like gothic hard rock band with these creepy, atmospherics going on all over the place. And then, the stadium rock of this, and then, kind of a mix of the two on here. All of a sudden, he's transformed these guys and this guy into something completely different. And then, you do something that's as kind of grand as The Wall by Pink Floyd, and then all of a sudden you're taking it to another level. And there is this, whether, and again, Ezrin is a musician as well. Masterful orchestrator and keyboard player and all that sort of thing. So he has always been big with recommending to the artists and bands that he's worked with to let's utilize whatever we need to utilize to get the sound you're looking for. So if we've got to bring in other musicians and orchestras and all that sort of thing, we'll make it happen. And whenever you listen to a Bob Ezrin production, it sounds like a big production. Even like David Gilmour's About Face. This, out of all of his albums, sounds big and huge. Peter Gabriel's first album, right? Certainly, I never would have thought to see it, but I love what he's done with Deep Purple in recent years. Yep. So you've got these last three albums from these guys. I never thought Deep Purple would sound so sophisticated. And all of a sudden you got this bunch of like, pretty much 70-year-olds that sound like they're in their 40s or 50s. That it is added a vibrancy to their sound, which I think was, maybe lacking on some of the albums that came before it. And, all of a sudden here you have this relationship that's been built. It's kind of like the Alice Cooper thing all over again. Now all of a sudden Deep Purple are really jacked about making new studio albums again and working with this guy, because they bring out the best at each other. They challenge each other. I mean, I heard it from Steve Morse's mouth directly. He said, Bob Ezrin challenges me. He has steered me to not overplay and play for the song and do what's right for the song. And you kind of get that with, as experimental as some of these albums are at times, everything is utilized to make perfect sense, I think, whatever they're using. And there's something to be said about that. And this is only like the tip of the iceberg of what else he's, worked on. But, he's done some stuff with, all sorts of other acts over the years. But but he's made his stamp with a lot of artists specifically. And now here he is working with, now Deep Purple. He's worked with Alice also in recent years. So, definitely a guy that knows what he's doing, and as demanding as he can be. I think all the artists who have worked with him have very fond memories of it. And that's why those relationships continue.
Yeah, exactly. All those Deep Purple guys think the world of him, and I love the sounds of those records.
Yeah, I absolutely do. Yep.
Destroyer is the best sounding Kiss album from those early days, right? And a lot of cool ideas on it. I disagree a little that I'm not crazy about the sound quality of the Alice Cooper stuff, but the big thing that he did for them is basically saved their career, I think, by straightening out those songs and tearing them apart and saying,
it's all about the arrangements, right? Yeah. I mean, I think absolutely. No, I agree with you there. Early on, those early Alice Cooper Band albums that he worked on, it's all about helping them define their sound. Yeah. I mean, there's much better sounding albums than, Love It to Death and Killer and all those. But I think that without him, they would have never been the big band that they were.
Oh yeah,
because
they loved him to death.
Absolutely.
Right. I mean, they basically loved what he did in terms of getting in there in the guts of the songs and really helping out. And you're right about the about all the arrangements and orchestration and stuff. That's one of his key things. Tony Visconti, same thing. You know, he'll bring in strings and stuff. At the drop of a hat, right?
Yep.
And Bob worked with Lou Reed as well.
Yep.
I can't remember who else off the top of my head, but obviously The Wall is the biggest thing he'll ever work on. Pretty incredible. Yeah, he's had a lot of stories about that, how hard that was put together.
Oh, I can imagine. How long did they spend in the studio to make that album?
I mean, that as a resume thing, you can't have a bigger thing, because it was also super challenging the whole time. So
yeah.
All right, so my last choice, bit of an odd one here, because I don't quite know what to say, because I've never really thought about it very much, but I thought this was such a great episode when you brought it up. Max Norman, one of the coolest things, one of the things about Max that's really cool is he's had this long history as an English guy, the long gray hair and stuff. But he was like a keyboard roadie and a lighting guy and a guitar roadie, and he went on the road with like Jethro Tull and Robin Trower and Heap for like 5 tours and stuff. So he had this whole history as well. He's a guitar player too, and as he puts it, he said, after a while of doing this and doing every job out on the road, I decided I better stay in one place and not get hurt all the time, right? Because it was a rough life, right? But then he got associated with Ridge Farm, and right off the bat, his signature is amazing on these records. They're 2 of the most distinct and unique and provocative and interesting and inspiring productions that he gets out of these guys. He essentially makes the Randy Rhoads sound. He's so much of the reason why Randy is so beloved. The sound that he gets out of these guys, and this sort of overdriven guitars, while having the drums kind of almost have a Reinhold Mack sort of feel to what he got out of Lee Kerslake there. But later on, I started looking into what he did, and I basically picked him because the guy doesn't screw up. The guy makes amazing sounding records. Sabotage, Power of the Night. Yeah. And I pulled these out to show because Coney Hatch, kind of a little known Canadian band. This is a band that should have been huge, especially off of these 2 albums. These sound monstrous, yet they're almost like they're a cross between hair metal and AC/DC, if you can believe it. They're just simple and straightforward and crushing, and Max did both of them, and they're just some of the greatest productions of all time. But then Death Angel Act 3 was a great one from him. Megadeth Countdown to Extinction, just so high fidelity and pure heavy metal. Almost getting into, well, not really that Rick Rubin zone, but just somehow hitting you between the eyes with perfection heavy metal. But yeah, you look at Lynch Mob, Wicked Sensation. He did a lot of kind of like lesser known hair metal bands. The Malice album sounds amazing as well. License to Kill. He did 220 Volt, Eye to Eye, Grim Reaper, Rock You to Hell. I was almost going to pick Daryl Johnson from the old Ebony Records, screaming, distorted guitars, put these records together in his living room thing. But that's a whole nother story. But yeah, I look at all the stuff he's done and at Y&T Black Tiger, and there's not exactly a distinct sound through them all, but there's just amazing productions on classic albums. So he's just obviously a guy who just does a great job. And that's really the only reason I picked him.
Didn't he do a couple of Loudness albums as well?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm kind of looking at a bit of a list I printed off.
I thought he did Thunder in the East, if I wasn't mistaken.
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure, but I
got Dangerous Toys here, Rough House, Concrete Jungle, Dirty Looks. I remember that one. Cool from the Wire. That sounded pretty good. Armored Saint, Delirious Nomad was a good song. Yeah, Loudness, Thunder in the East, you're right. Lightning Strikes and Soldier of Fortune. Thunder in the East sounds amazing.
Oh, right? Great sounding album. Yeah. Even really after that too. Yeah.
But Power of the Night, man. Sabotage, Power of the Night, just smoking record. Yeah. And just really good, just straight conservative, high fidelity guitar, bass, drums, and vocals.
Well, yeah, he knew how to produce guitars in a big way. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, when it comes to those two Ozzy records, it's like, in fact, we just debated this on an episode of the Guitarist Corner recently, is that with Blizzard, it's almost like he wasn't quite sure yet how to produce Randy, because if you listen to Randy's guitar tone on that album and then on Diary, it's like night and day. Diary is amazing. I mean, his guitar tone is absolutely killer on that album, whereas it's a little not quite there yet on the first album, but the album overall as a whole, Blizzard of Oz, is a great sounding album.
Yeah. It's almost like the most interesting thing is the relationship between the guitar and Lee Kerslake on those albums, right?
Yeah.
Lee, like I say, Lee's kind of like put in this odd place of Mackness, just this slappy sort of sound that you get out of him, right? And Randy is like double the volume of everybody else, kind of thing. Yeah. Pretty cool. But that is his eccentric production, and most of these other ones you wouldn't say are eccentric in any way.
Yeah. Cool. Good choice. All right, my number one guy. I knew going into this assignment that he was going to be my number one guy. And it's just amazing how many classic albums he has worked on, either as a producer or engineer in his career, mostly as an engineer in the 70s. And he worked with everybody from Fleetwood Mac to Deep Purple to bands that I'm going to talk about now. Martin Birch. And again, this is one of those instances where I think some of these other guys, their albums may sound sonically a little bit better, but there is, for the most part, a Martin Birch album when you hear it, even though some of these albums do sound quite different from each other. I mean, a case in point. So let me grab him here. So he, of course, worked with Black Sabbath on, when Dio came into the band, because Ronnie had previously worked with Martin in Rainbow. And he's engineered, I think, the first album, and Long Live Rock and Roll. And he produced Rainbow Rising, which, as great as an album it is, this maybe isn't one of the greatest sounding albums of all time. It's fine, right? But he's done better. And then, he comes in and he works on Heaven and Hell, and he works on Mob Rules. Production wise, sonically speaking, these are very different from each other. I'd argue, even though I prefer Heaven and Hell as an album by a little bit, I think Mob Rules is a much better sounding album. This is like full of life. It breathes more, whereas this is a little on the cold, sterile side, which I think you can probably say for a lot of these albums that he's worked on, but yet that's okay. And I think he worked very, very well with Whitesnake. So he did obviously Slide It In, okay, which Keith Olsen mixed this album when it was released in America, but the Martin Birch production is there. Saints and Sinners, Come and Get It, which I think are fine sounding albums. I think within that kind of blues rock context, I think Martin's style was perfect. He also did another perfect example, kind of like the Black Sabbath thing. So he worked on Cultosaurus Erectus and Fire of Unknown Origin. Both great albums, both very Martin Birch-y, but they don't really sound anything alike. And I think this album, I hate doing that, this album, a little cold, sterile sounding, as great as it is, where this is absolutely full of life. This is like the Mob Rules to the Heaven and Hell in this equation. Interesting how he did that, right? Both albums back to back, both totally different productions. He, arguably for me, one of my favorite productions by him is Assault Attack by Michael Schenker Group. This is larger than life. Guitars sparkling, the vocals roaring, the rhythms, the drums. I mean, this is a great, great sounding album. And then, of course, there's the Iron Maiden story, right? So you've got, Killers and Number of the Beast and Peace of Mind and, Power Slave and so on and so forth. And probably he has made his identity stamp with all the Maiden albums, and you could argue about which ones sound better than the others. Are any of them true high fidelity? Do they really need to be? I don't know. There is a very similar style, feel, and sound to all of these Maiden albums, which I think has, again, really helped shape this band, because you listen to like the first Maiden album and you listen to this and then you listen to this, and it's almost like these guys were made for each other to kind of, him to help take them to the next level. You could arguably say that a lot of these other albums sound better than the Maiden albums, although I think, by the time Power Slave and Somewhere in Time came along, pretty good sounding records, I think, but again, they're from its time, and there's maybe no Roy Thomas Baker isms here or Bob Ezrin isms here, but they didn't really need to be. This is just good, well-produced hard rock and heavy metal stuff. That's exactly what you need to be. No frills. Here's the band. Enjoy, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the one place where you do get a Martin Birch sound is on the drums of Cultosaurus, possibly matched by the drums of Fire of Unknown Origins, certainly the drums of Heaven and Hell, the early White Snakes, and maybe even Number of the Beast, where you've got this sort of everything's kind of lifted up a little and put forward. It's like the lows are not there on the bass drum particularly, and the snare is quite loud. And it's a little mid-rangey and loud at the same time. And I think you get a little bit of that on those albums, and it's one of the only kind of signatures. And I remember reading a long interview with him once where he kind of explained why he did that. And I thought that was pretty cool because it showed that it was pretty intentional. But, you know, I mean, slide it in is a whole different thing. Like you say, Mob Rules is a whole different thing. He had a lot of different sounds, and I think unfortunately, you know, he's no longer with us, but unfortunately I think you got to take a little bit away from his reputation in the later Iron Maiden albums, where it really, you know, granted it's Steve Harris kind of getting his way, but you know, going exclusive with Maiden is one thing, and that's kind of an interesting thing to do, but I think the productions are slowly going down over time. With what he did with Maiden.
But they're unremarkable, right? They're a little unremarkable. There, yeah. I mean, you bring up the whole mid-ragey thing, and I think that was kind of his signature right there. Yeah, there's nothing, you know, are any of these genius recordings? Arguably not. They're all great albums though, so there's something to be said for that. I don't know, like I said, I've always had a soft spot for all of his productions, and you know, even some of the stuff, you know, the Deep Purple albums that he engineered, and then the Fleetwood Mac stuff from the early mid 70s. Really solid stuff.
I'd say Assault Attack is genius, and I would say both of the Sabbaths are genius, but in two different ways. I mean, absolutely, yep. Heaven and Hell is a very odd, bright, distinctive. I mean, I think a lot of the reason for that record doing so well is that production on there. It's like you say, there's things you could say that you don't quite like about it, but it's really bizarre and interesting, and I guess it translates well to radio. It's just so in your face. It's so guitar-y. Because those mids are not, or the low end isn't there, and then on Mob Rules it's all low end, right? It's like just a monstrous billowy pillowy bottom end on it, right?
Well, he got Tony to sound a little bit different, because if you listen to Heaven and Hell, then you listen to you know, obviously Never Say Die and Technical Ecstasy and Sabotage. I mean, his guitar tone doesn't sound anything like that at all. Yeah. So it's almost like, you know, him and Tony sat down, they said, all right, so here we are moving into the 80s. There's this whole new wave of British heavy metal thing. We got to do something a little bit different. We need some success. You know, maybe we need a little bit of radio airplay, who knows? But yeah, I mean, Heaven and Hell sounds big and just, it's not as massive and bottom endy as Mob Rules, but there is a sheen to Heaven and Hell that I think we never got on a Black Sabbath record before. And it worked, right? New singer, different than Ozzy, right? New style of writing. Yeah, it just really worked. And
one last thing to say about Martin, everybody loved him to death. They thought he was just the greatest guy to work with. He was easy to work with. He was a funny dude. He had a lot of ideas. He was hardworking. So that's the thing. Everybody always had good things to say about him.
You ever, I used to do this with friends back in the day, you know, when he just started working with Maiden exclusively after the Blue Oyster Cult, White Snake, and Black Sabbath stuff. Were there any like acts that you really wanted him to work with that he didn't? Like, can you think of any bands from like that era that would have been a good pairing with him?
Yeah, we thought about that. I remember you asking that question before. It's like I always can't figure it out because he doesn't have his own sound. He just doesn't literally have a certain Martin Birch sound to him. So, you know, I mean, I guess he never worked with Deep Purple again, right?
No.
So it's Roger doing, you know, I mean, if Martin Birch had been around for Perfect Strangers or House of Blue Light or something, right?
Yeah.
Pretty cool. Yeah. But Roger does a
great job. It would have been interesting to hear him on House of Blue Light, because I'm not a big fan of the production on that album.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know. And there's probably a lot of cool, like, new wave of British heavy metal bands that would have, you know, maybe been interesting, like Saxon, to hear him work with, or, you know, maybe Def Leppard before they got involved with Mutt, you know? Yeah. And then, you know, it's funny, we really haven't didn't touch on, maybe Ezrin to an extent, but producers like Mutt Lange, who get Kevin Shirley, who gets so involved in every little thing that's going on, almost to the point of complete excess, right? And do they completely change a band's sound because of how anal and involved that they get, where they totally transform everything, right? For the good or not, right? So
yeah, I had a long list of guys, worth talking about, but you don't know whether they should be at the top of your list. It's almost like mostly negatives, or like it's a patchy thing. They did some good things and some bad things, right? So
yeah.
No, it was a good list.
Yeah, if anything else, I think everybody that we picked were pretty consistent, and I think that's what I was looking for when I was putting this together. Is producers that were fairly consistent, worked on a lot of really great albums that I love a lot, and whether there's a signature sound there or not, these albums really work to my ears, and that's what it's all about anyway. So you want to hear what that honorable mention was that I booted out the last minute? Alex Perialis.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So, in the 80s, man, I mean, I was a thrash fiend. I mean, I was listening to thrash bands like crazy. And man, he worked on, those SOD records, Anthrax, Testament, Overkill. I mean, there was that Alex P sound, we used to call it, where it was just like, man, it was just all really like low recorded albums that you had to crank up to like 15, but then when you did, it was just like, oh my god, so ferocious and just like monolithic sounding. But he had this like short period of time, and then all of a sudden you didn't hear much from him anymore. I think it's because once like the mid 90s came around, I mean, that kind of whole sound and style was kind of passe already. But I still listen to some of those old records by those bands. I'm like, oh yeah, Alex, he was the guy. Everybody wanted him back then. If you were a metal band, and specifically a thrash band, you had to get Alex, right? So but
cool.
Yeah. All right, everybody, there you have it. So any producers you really like that you want to discuss in the comments below, please do so. So I'll be curious to check out. I'm sure there's some great ones that I kind of forgot, but that's all right. I like these guys quite a bit. So Martin and I will be back. You don't have to wait a week to see us again, because we will be back on Sunday for the second episode of Album Homework Assignment, where Martin and I have been busy listening to each other's assignment. So I'm not going to give anything away. So you'll have to wait till Sunday to find out what the albums are and what we think of them. And Jamie Laszlo will be actually sitting in my seat for that particular episode. So he will be actually doing the moderating and introducing everything. So stay tuned for that on this Sunday, each and every Sunday going forward. And then Martin and I will be back next week. I think we have an idea for next week's show. It looks like we're going to possibly do a ranking show. So we'll announce that over the next couple of days. Just we got to make sure about a couple things, and then we'll see you all then. So Martin, what's going on with the Contrarians and books and all that kind of stuff on your end?
Yeah, well, martinpopoff.com for the books. And Contrarians, we did a Budgie show recently. Yesterday, we knocked off a Heart show that I picked a very contrarian choice for my favorite Heart album. And I've done the last 2 episodes of my podcast, History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff, where you had to be there, and you didn't have to be there. So bands that I thought, I love, but I'm kind of subjective about telling you these are the greatest bands in the world. It might have a little bit of a you had to be there. But then the second one was, I objectively think these things are genius, and you didn't have to be there to love these bands. So that was that. Right?
Yeah, it's a cool concept. It's cool. You could probably go on with that for days, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks for watching, everybody. We appreciate it. Visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. Of course, we're here on YouTube all the damn time. For Martin Popoff, I am Pete Pardo. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And we'll see you tomorrow morning with Forgotten Favorites, and Sunday for Album Homework Assignment. Take care. Have a good weekend, everybody. Bye-bye.